Hello. Hello to everyone. Good morning and good afternoon too. Thanks a lot for your attendance. I'm the Knowledge Management and Learning Coordinator of the European initiative Bridge the Gap. Bridge the Gap is a European funded project coordinated by the International and Ibero-American Foundation for Administration and Public Policies, FIAP, in partnership with 3 agencies for development cooperation of the European Union, the Spanish, the Austrian, and the Italian agency. Partners of the project are also 2 international NGOs, the European Disability Forum and the International Disability and Development Consortium. The project aims to contribute to the socio-economic inclusion, equality and non-discrimination of persons with disability through more inclusive and accountable institutions and policies. Bridge the Gap has developed as a comprehensive 3-pillar knowledge management strategy, and this webinar training cycle is proposed in the framework of the 3rd pillar of the strategy, learning spaces to learn and train. This cycle will gradually explore the different cross-cutting issues taken into consideration by the project, and it aims to foster a culture of disability mainstreaming in development and to define an homogeneous approach to the project cross-cutting topics. The session of today is the first webinar of the training cycle, and it focuses on understanding of the CRPD and analyzing its principle and structure. The session starts by explaining the concept of disability as fundamental step to understand why the CRPD is a necessary human rights tool. To help us to understand what I said now, today we can count on the experience and the knowledge about this important topic of An-Sofie Leenknecht, the Human Rights Coordinator of the European Disability Forum, one of the partners of this initiative. Well, before leaving the floor to An-Sofie, I would like firstly to thank you, An-Sofie, for your participation and give you some technical tips. The webinar is live captioned, and you can follow the live captioning through the link you can find in the reminder email you received some hours ago, and you can find also the link in the chat box here. During the session, you can download also the document proposed in support of this webinar, the same that you received also in the reminder email last Friday. Just to give you a quick overview about the webinar, now I will leave the floor to An-Sofie, who will introduce the session. During this phase, you can also make some questions and interact with the session. Then An-Sofie will start with the presentation, and it will last more or less 30-40 minutes. The last part of the session, more or less 30 minutes again, will be dedicated to answer and question, and I will open the debate to the audience. You can text the question in the chat box or just raising your hands, and I will allow you to talk and make the question to our panelists. I think I said everything, so thanks a lot. I leave the floor to An-Sofie, and enjoy the session.
Thank you very much, Alicia. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm An-Sofie Leenknecht of the European Disability Forum, and I'm here in the room together with Alicia. And I'm very happy to talk to you this afternoon at this webinar on the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and its principles and attributes. I want to thank Alicia and the organizer of Bridging the Gap for giving us this opportunity. And I have a PowerPoint presentation that I hope you all can see. Okay, so maybe first some words on the European Disability Forum itself. The European Disability Forum is a European-wide organization of people with disabilities. So we basically have member organizations both at the national level in each of the EU member states, but also at the European Union level. So there's organizations that really specifically look and represent people with disabilities from a specific group, such as, for example, Autism Europe, there's European Union of the Deaf, or Inclusion Europe, representing people with intellectual disabilities. So altogether, we have 98 member organizations, and we represent about 80 million people with disabilities in Europe. And so we aim to have within our membership really the full diversity of people with disabilities. So we have blind people, deaf-blind people, people who are deaf, people who have intellectual, psychosocial disabilities, and also people with physical disabilities. And so our main aim is really to promote their human rights, both at the European Union level, but also at the international level. And so as Alicia was saying, today I will introduce to you the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And so during my presentation, please do not hesitate to ask us questions. We will aim at answering all of them. But I will first of all introduce you a bit to the different approaches to disability. So how are people with disabilities seen and what has been the evolution in looking at people with disabilities up until the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. Then I will also talk about the purpose of the convention and whom it actually protects. We will look at its general principles. We will also see at who is responsible actually for implementing the convention and what needs to be done by the governments. And we will then also lastly focus on how is it enforced, both at the national and at the international level. And I hope there will be plenty of time left for you to give your comments, to give your questions, and for me to also provide you with some answers. But maybe first of all, as a kind of icebreaker, I wanted to maybe hear some of you and to hear from you how people with disabilities are seen in your country. Can you give me an example of a situation which people with disabilities in your country encounters? If some of you would feel like commenting on this or answering, that would be really great to start this webinar. I don't know, Alicia, if someone is willing to.
So thanks a lot, An-Sofie. I don't know if people have some question about this introduction. And so, or someone want to add something, just wait, because I have Ilaria D'Annunzio, but I will give you now the floor to make your question. Now, Ilaria, you can talk.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for this opportunity.
Sorry.
Oh, it's very okay. I'm calling. Well, I'm in the webinar from Guinea-Bissau. I'm working here with the Italian NGO IFO, and we are working on a project for women with disability in particular, or people with disability, but in particular women. And just to answer, like, I think that this webinar is very important because here, for example, the situation of people with disability is very difficult. For example, yesterday I was in a village here, and one reaction of, we were discussing about people with disability, and one reaction was that they are spirits from somewhere, and they have to, sometimes they just have to die because this is what God is saying, or something like that. So I think that where in Africa in particular, there are a lot of situations like this, and I wanted just to share this situation. We are doing some, like, a lot with IFO, with other NGOs here. We are trying to do some technical training for governments about the convention and about our role, their role, like they have responsibility, like civil society, and we are working here with the National Federation of Association of People with Disability. So I wanted just to share our work here, and thanks, just say thanks for this opportunity.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting. we are a bit too close to each other, Alicia and I think so. There's a bit of resonation. Thank you very much for this input. And it really shows a bit what I want to explain to you, that actually disability, how it works, there's different ways to looking at it. And the disability, how it's actually looked at by the UN Convention, is what we see in the next slide. So maybe I will continue with the webinar now. And I wanted to show you that within the convention, disability is looked at both as an interaction between the personal factors, so the factors that really characterize a person. As you said, the person has a certain impairment, is seen for that impairment. Also, the person might be rich, might be poor, might be living in a village or in the city, might have enjoyed education or not. So these are all the personal factors that play. But then there's also the environmental factors. So the person might live in a city that is not accessible. You know, the city might not be accessible, the public transport might not be accessible, but also we can think of the legal framework. There might not be any legislation in that person's country that protects the person against discrimination. So these would be called the environmental factors. And how the convention really looks at people with disabilities, as they say, disability is an interaction between both the personal factors, so the impairment of the person, and then the environment. And it often results really in the fact that people with disabilities cannot fully participate in society, because society is not fully inclusive and not fully accessible to their personal factors, to their impairment. So this is kind of the basis of how we will talk about people with disabilities in this webinar. And maybe to make it a bit more clear, I have two examples here in the next slides. If I can move them, let's see. So disability as being a result between the non-inclusive society and individuals, we can think, for example, about a man in a wheelchair. I have a picture here on the slide of a man in a wheelchair who stands in front of a huge staircase, and the man has just found a job, but unfortunately he's not able to actually go perform his job because the building where he has to go work has a huge staircase, or, for example, the transport to bring him from home to work might not be accessible. So this is an example of how we see disability. The same is true, for example, for a deaf woman who has to go with her child to the doctor. And as long, of course, as there's no sign language interpretation provided, she will not be able to communicate with the doctor. So these are some kind of examples of how we look at disability. However, it has not always been this way that society looked at disability. We have actually, the approach to people with disabilities have been changed over time. And here in the next slide, you really see the four main approaches that society takes or has taken to people with disabilities in the past up until today. So there's a charity approach to disability, then there's the medical approach, the social approach, and the human rights approach. So I will explain all four approaches, but you will see that actually the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities promotes and enshrines the human rights approach to people with disabilities. So that will be the last one that I will explain. So the first approach is a charity approach, and maybe in a lot of your countries, the charity approach is still the one that is being used. And the charity approach really sees people with disabilities as people living in tragic situations, people that are poor people, people that we need to help, we need to collect money for them, and we really need to support them because they cannot take care of themselves. So this is what we call the charity approach. And they're the most of the ones that are actually responsible for people with disabilities are charity houses or charity foundations. So this is a first approach to people with disabilities. Then another one is the medical approach. The medical approach basically sees people with disabilities as people who are abnormal, people who need to be fixed, people who need to be cured, people who need to receive as much as possible any rehabilitation so that they can become normal and that they can participate in society. So this medical approach, obviously most decisions there are taken by doctors, are taken by the Ministry of Health. They're not taken by people with disabilities themselves because they're mostly seen as passive. They have a passive role as a patient. So this would be the medical approach to disability. However, unfortunately, both this charity and medical approach to people with disabilities has had very negative consequences on the life of people with disabilities. and on the enjoyment of their rights. And so on the next slide, you see just some of the examples and of the consequences of these kind of approaches. We can think, for example, of children with disabilities that are in most countries still going to segregated education. So they go to special schools. They're not able, or they're not enabled actually to go to mainstream schools and to follow education with children without disabilities. So this would be already one consequence. Another consequence is that many people with disabilities are forced to actually live in institutions. As in many countries, maybe also in yours, people with disabilities do not have the option to choose where to live or with whom to live or how to live, as in many countries there's not sufficient support provided to live wherever you want to live. So many people are forced to actually go live in institutions. These kind of approaches obviously have had a great negative impact on the self-esteem of people with disabilities and have really created very negative stereotypes about people with disabilities, saying that people with disabilities are less of a citizen or less of a person, like we saw in the medical and in the charity approach, that you have to take care of them. So it has really led to a lot of stigmatization and also to a lot of disempowerment of the person with disability themselves, because they are not informed about their rights. They also are not able to claim their rights. So in these kind of models also, the state is very absent. And so, and if the state intervenes, it's really more under the auspices of, okay, we're going to do some voluntary work where we're not obliged. This is not a duty, not a legal duty of us to actually support people with disabilities. This is more of a voluntary work. So these are some of the consequences of this charity and this medical approach. Luckily, we have already evolved to some other approaches to look at disability. And for example, the social approach doesn't look at disability anymore from only the personal characteristics. It doesn't say, okay, the disability is a problem of the person itself. It actually says that the disability is a problem of society. The fact that society is organized in a way that doesn't include people with disabilities. People with disabilities face barriers in society, which prevents actually their equal participation. And then we can think of barriers such as environmental barriers. As I already said, inaccessibility of the public environment, inaccessibility of transport, inaccessibility of public services, of schools, of hospitals. We can also think of barriers such as attitudinal barriers, the fact that people with disabilities are seen in a negative way, that they are stigmatized. So all of these barriers, which are created by society in interaction with the person's impairment, prevents the person from actually participating on an equal basis with others, so as anyone else in society. And here the social model really calls upon people with disabilities to be able to participate in public policy making, so that we can ensure that all public services and all public policies are accessible and inclusive for them. And the ones that are responsible here are obviously the state, but then we don't only look at the Ministry of Health, but we look at all ministries. So all ministries have their responsibility to ensure that people with disabilities can fully participate, and society as a whole, every individual in society also has a responsibility on this. So this would be the social model to disability. Then if we look at the next and the last model, next and the last approach to people with disabilities, the one that actually is enshrined with the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, it's really the human rights-based approach to people with disabilities. And it looks at people with disabilities as part of human diversity. Because being a human is, of course, part of being within a broad spectrum of different possibilities. Each and every one of us is different. Each and every one of us has different ways of communicating, has different ways of seeing things, of thinking, of also walking. So here people with disabilities are seen as part of humankind. And the human rights approach really sees people with disabilities as part of society, together with people without disabilities. And it says people with disabilities have the same rights and the same obligation just as anyone else in society. And they should, of course, enjoy all the human rights just as anyone else in society, and they should be full rights holders. So they really should be able to make decisions about their own life and to do this at all times. One of the very important concepts that might come in another webinar is the concept of equal recognition before the law. The fact that people with disabilities at all times should have their legal capacity, because many people with disabilities today are denied their legal capacity, and this means that their legal personhood has been taken away, which prevents them from taking any legal decision in their lives. They cannot sign an employment contract, they cannot decide to get married, they cannot decide to sign a lease contract when they want to rent an apartment, for example. So the convention really, as one of its main rights, says that people with disabilities at all times should have their legal capacity, should remain within their legal personhood, so they can make decisions to organize their own life and to be able to be fully included in all activities of society, be it school or family life, community life, work. All laws should be enforced so that they are able to fully and on an equal level with others be able to participate. So here again, the ones that are responsible are the state, obviously, and all ministries that are within the state, and also society as a whole. So these are the 4 approaches to disabilities that, as you have seen, have evolved over time. And with the convention, we have really what we call this paradigm shift in attitudes and in approaches to persons with disabilities, because people with disabilities are no longer seen by the convention as objects of charity, of medical treatment, social protection. People with disabilities are really rights holders. They are capable of claiming their own rights, of making decisions about their own lives, based, of course, on free and informed consent, and they should be able to be active citizens within society. So this is the human rights-based approach to disability. This is the one that is enshrined in the convention. And if we turn to the convention itself now, you can see in its Article 1, where it states that persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. So this is really a key article within the convention. It's not quite a definition of disability, because also the convention in its preamble, so in the text of the convention that goes before the articles, the preamble of the convention, it states that disability is actually an evolving concept, is a concept that changes over time, that might change over time as societies might become more inclusive. But it might also change from how you see disability, might also change from society to society, because some societies might be more accessible and more inclusive of people with disabilities than others. So this Article 1 really reflects the human rights-based approach to disability. And important here is also to state, or to look at the word include, where it says people with disabilities include those who have. So it's to say that this article does not have an exhaustive list of who is a person with disability today, but that, of course, other people with disabilities can also be considered having a disability, and it might not be included in this list. So this was Article 1 of the convention. Now, when we turn a bit more to the convention itself, and maybe just some words on what is actually the UN Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities, then I would like to tell you that it's an internationally agreed document that recognizes the universal human rights standards on the rights of people with disabilities. So we often say that it supersedes all other and older instruments that talk about the rights of people with disabilities. In Europe, we can think of the European Convention on Human Rights, or all other national or European legislation that predates the CRPD should actually be interpreted and applied in light of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, as this is the latest and the most universal legal instrument that enshrines all these human rights standards of people with disabilities. And so it talks about the rights that people with disabilities have. It also looks at what the obligations are for the states to promote and to protect the human rights. And it also sets out what are the ways of implementing the rights that are enshrined in the convention and how to monitor them, both at the national and the international level. But that I will explain to you a bit further in the webinar. So the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2006. And it was actually quite a unique process because for the first time in history, not only the state parties of the United Nations were drafting and negotiating on the text of the UN Convention, also organizations of people with disabilities themselves were sitting around a table and were actually, together with the state parties, negotiating and drafting the text, which is a very unique way of working. And so the United Nations Convention was open for signature in 2007, and already, very many countries have ratified the convention quite quickly. And so today we have 176 countries already worldwide that have ratified. And within Europe, we have universal ratification of the UN Convention because since 2 weeks, we have all EU member states that have ratified the convention. And also we have the European Union itself that also has ratified the convention, also for the first time in its history. So this is a little bit on the history of the convention itself. And then when we turn to Article 1 of the convention, it talks more specifically about what is the purpose of the convention. And there it reads that the convention is there to promote, to protect and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. So this is really what is the purpose, what is the meaning of the UN Convention. And when we look at the word promote, protect, ensure, we can think of to promote all human rights by people with disabilities is really that states have to take all actions to uphold the rights of that are enshrined in the convention. And to protect means actually the state should ensure that no one is denied all the rights that are enshrined in the convention. So also third parties should make sure that they do not discriminate against people with disabilities. And to ensure is, of course, that the state has to take many proactive measures so that people with disabilities actually have access to all of the rights that are written down in the convention. So these are three important words that we could spend another webinar on. But so two other words that I also wanted to highlight is the word enjoyment of all human rights by all people with disabilities, because I want to stress that there's really no hierarchy between the human rights that are written in the convention, and also no hierarchy between certain groups of people with disabilities. It's really that the convention says that all groups of people with disabilities should be able to enjoy all human rights. For example, children with intellectual disability or deaf children, they equally should have access to mainstream inclusive education, or people with psychosocial disabilities and people with people living with a wheelchair should equally have access to be living in the community and to live where they want and with whom they want. So really there should not be a hierarchy between certain groups of people with disabilities and certain groups of rights. So this is also a very important thing to consider. And so when we turn to whom is actually protected by the convention, we already said it, and then we turn back to this concept of disability that is enshrined in Article 1. And here, as I already said, the convention really covers the diversity of people with disabilities. So it protects people both with physical disabilities, people with intellectual, psychosocial disabilities, people who are blind, who are deaf-blind. So whenever you undertake anything on the rights of people with disabilities, it's important to think of this diversity, of people with disabilities and try to support all these different groups. But then I also already wanted to tell you that the convention looks more into depth into specific groups of people with disabilities, which are women and children with disabilities. They each have a specific article within the convention. For women with disabilities, it's Article 6 of the convention, and for children with disabilities, it's Article 7. And so, because of course they have recognized, as there are other groups also, but they have recognized for women and children with disabilities that they are even more at the margins of society, and they have even more difficulties for enjoying their human rights. So it's important in the actions that everyone is undertaking, so the state, but also third parties, that you mainstream the rights of women and girls with disabilities and of boys with disabilities, and that you also undertake specific actions to ensure that they're always included in anything you undertake. Of course, there's other groups of people with disabilities that we have to pay particular attention to. There's older people with disabilities that face specific barriers Very recently, also my organization has started working on refugees with disabilities, which is another group within Europe that face many barriers to actually be included in all the public services that are out there for refugees in general, that have obviously more obstacles than others also to participate in education, in work. So there's obviously many different groups of people with disabilities that we have to think of when we work on this issue. Now, another very important article within the convention is Article 3. And Article 3 really looks at what are the principles of the convention, which basically means is what is the basis that you have to take whenever you're undertaking any project, whenever there's any proposal for new law, for new policy. These kind of principles have to always be respected. They also apply to all of the rights within the convention, so to all of the different areas of life, and they are connected with each other. So really, this is one of the most important articles within the convention, and this is really something to look at whenever you're doing anything on the rights of people with disabilities. And for example, we can read that one of the principles is the respect for dignity and individual autonomy. So here, the convention actually means that every person should be able to make decisions for him or for herself. So it talks about self-determination. As I already said, every person with disability should have their legal capacity. They should have the right to decide themselves where they go to work, where they go to school, where they go to live, whom to marry, where they go to the theater, which sports they want to undertake, where they go voting. So this really talks about individual autonomy. Then the next principle talks about non-discrimination, as this is really also one of the cornerstones of the convention. And it basically means that people with disabilities should not be discriminated against in any area of life, whether it be healthcare, also on the right to vote. Many people with disabilities are not able to vote because many people with disabilities are deprived of the legal capacity. So also people with disabilities should not be discriminated against in all areas of life. People with disabilities should be able to participate and be included in society, which is the next principle. So they should not be put in separate or segregated structures, be it institutions or be it segregated schools. People with disabilities should always be supported to be able to be included and participate in all activities of society, just like anyone else. Then the next principle looks at the respect for difference and diversity, and this comes really back to the human rights-based approach to disability and to the diversity that we have within humankind and the respect that we need to have for this. Then another very important principle is the one on accessibility. And accessibility here, we don't only mean the accessibility of the buildings or of transport, we also mean accessibility of information and communication. And there it's important to think of providing information in Braille, for example, for blind people, or in easy to read information for people with intellectual disabilities. Or if we think of deaf people, we'll need to foresee sign language interpretation or captioning as we have it today in this webinar. This is really also one of the cornerstones of the convention. And then I'll just take another one, which is equality between men and women. As I already said, there is obviously Article 6 of the convention that talks about women and girls with disabilities, but also gender equality is a very important component of this convention, as the difference between women with disabilities and women without disabilities is obviously big. I mean, women with disabilities face more barriers to enjoyment of their rights than women without disabilities, but they even face more barriers than men with disabilities. So this is also an important aspect to take into account. So these were the principles, and I really would encourage you to have them next to you, next to your whatever you're undertaking, as are really the ones that should be followed at all times. Then we have another look at who is responsible actually for implementing the convention. And here we have already stated that it's the state. It's basically all ministries that are responsible, not only the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Social Affairs, but actually all ministries that should take responsibility in implementing these rights. But also the Parliament and the courts play an important role in this. And the state basically has to ensure that all of its government, its parliaments, its justice system works to implement the convention, but that also the private sector The business sector, the private sector does not discriminate against people with disabilities. Also, that all professionals working in the justice sector, in the police sector, in the teaching sector, in the health sector, that basically they respect the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and that of course all of society is awareness is being raised on this, and that everyone does not discriminate against people with disabilities, basically. And you can give an example how the state has to ensure that, for example, the business sector should not discriminate against people with disabilities. When we think of an employer that wants to employ a new colleague, then obviously the employer cannot say, but you have a disability, so I'm not gonna take you. You're not suitable for the job because of your disability. This would be discrimination, and so the state has to ensure that does not happen, and it can ensure this by adopting non-discrimination legislation. So these are really the different actors in society that are responsible for implementing the convention. And what needs actually to be done? Very many different things needs to be done. And here we can look at Article 4 of the Convention, which looks more specifically at what are the general obligations. And so what are the general obligations? What needs to be done by the state is obviously the state needs to look at all of its legislation, at all of its policies, and it needs to see where it discriminates against people with disabilities. And for these laws and policies that actually discriminate, they have to change them. They have to change them. They might also have to adopt new pieces of legislation, and they also might have to look at mainstreaming the rights of people with disabilities within all relevant laws and policies. So this is one of the first things that a state should do for implementing the convention. Then also the state should raise awareness on the rights of people with disabilities, and of course on the human rights approach to disability. It's important that society as a whole is aware that people with disabilities are, just like anyone else, citizens with rights and with obligations. And the state should also provide and fund training for professionals. As we already said, professionals both in the justice, in the police sector, in the health sector, in education, employment sector, trade unions, for example. They should all be trained in what is the UN Convention and what is this human rights-based approach to disability. It's also important that more research is undertaken on the rights of people with disabilities, as today we still really lack a lot of information on who are people with disabilities, what are the support needs of people with disabilities. Also, research should go in making certain goods and services more accessible, as this will allow, obviously, people with disabilities to participate fully in society, to take a public transport, to take the train to another country, to be able to go to the ATM and take out money just like anyone else. So also goods and services should be made accessible. The state also has to make a priority of collecting data on people with disabilities, and this data should always be disaggregated by gender, but also preferably by age. We really have a huge gap also within Europe on data on the rights of people with disabilities. Obviously, the state also has to strengthen its own institutions, its own ministries, its own courts, for example, by training on the UN Convention. Also, national human rights institutions should receive the necessary training and the necessary funding to work on the convention. And lastly here, the state should also build the capacity of organizations of people with disabilities and people with disabilities themselves. So they should inform them about the rights they have, about how they can claim their rights. And they should really build the capacity and fund organizations of people with disabilities to be able to meaningfully participate in policy making. So these are some of the examples of what the state needs to be done. There's probably other ones that you might think of, but these are really some of the main ones that the state needs to be doing when it's implementing the UN Convention on the rights of people with disabilities. I'm just going to have some water. And another thing that the state has to do, which is very important, is to let people with disabilities and their representative organizations participate in the development of new legislation, of new policy. As I said earlier, people with disabilities and their organizations were sitting around the table in New York when the UN Convention was drafted. And from that time comes actually the slogan that you might have heard, "Nothing about us without us," which is really a call of people with disabilities themselves to be involved whenever the others talk about their lives, basically. And so the convention has really enshrined this right and this call in both Article 4 and Article 33. Article 4 looks more generally about the fact that people with disabilities should always be closely consulted and actively involved through their representative organizations in all decision-making processes that the state undertakes. So if the state is adopting a new law, is drafting a new policy, or is monitoring how its implementation is going, from the very beginning until the very end, people with disabilities, through their representative organizations, should be involved in this process. And this at all levels of policy making, be it at the international, the regional, the national, and the local level. So this is really one of the key articles of the convention also. And the convention states the same for monitoring of the convention, so also in the process of monitoring what the state is actually doing to implementing the convention. Also there, people with disabilities and their organizations should be fully involved and fully participate in this process. Now we're almost getting to the end. And so just a few words on how the convention is actually enforced. Also here again, we could talk about this much longer. And if you have questions, please do not hesitate to ask them. But the convention is enforced at the national level in two different levels. So you have, first of all, the enforcement through implementation. So who's responsible for implementing? We already said it's the state. And what the state basically needs to do is they have to appoint a focal point within its government, the one that is responsible for implementing the convention. So you can have a main one, but then of course you can have smaller focal points within all the other ministries, because as we also said, all ministries will have some responsibility to implement the convention. And it's very important that this focal point sits at a strategic place within the government, preferably at the level of the Prime Minister or within the Ministry of Justice, as it's important obviously to promote the human rights approach to people with disabilities. Too often still in Europe and also at the European Union level, we see that the focal point is still sitting in the Ministry of Health or in the Ministry of Social Affairs, which kind of brings us back more to the medical approach to people with disabilities. So it's important that this focal point sits within the Ministry of Justice, for example. Preferably, the state should also have a coordination mechanism where all the focal points are brought together and their work is coordinated. So this happens at the level of the government. Then there's also responsibility to monitor the implementation of the convention. This happens with an independent monitoring framework that the state has to establish, has to appoint. In many countries, this is the National Human Rights Institution, or it can also be the Ombudsman that will look at how the state is doing in implementing the convention. And there again, as I said before, it's very important to involve people with disabilities and their representative organizations and other civil society organizations in this monitoring exercise. And then at the international level, I just wanted to mention to you that there is, of course, the United Nations Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities that meets twice in Geneva per year. And so this committee is a group of experts that really revises how every country is doing with regards to the implementation of the convention. So they receive state reports and they go have a general constructive dialogue with the state, and they make also recommendations on how states can improve on the implementation of the convention. But the committee can also receive individual complaints. So if an individual feels like their rights are violated, then they can also write to the committee, and the committee can also investigate that. That happens under the optional protocol to the convention, which is an additional legal instrument to the UN Convention, which gives these rights to these individuals. So this is really, in a snapshot, an introduction to the convention, to its principles, its attributes. I hope it was helpful for you. But please, I'm open. As I said, we will aim at answering all, but if not, please do not hesitate also to send us what you might have afterwards. I have included in the slides my email address. So you're welcome to send me an email, to drop me a line, and to continue this conversation. But thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, An-Sofie, for this really interesting presentation. So I think that we really understood how much is important the convention and how much is really changed the approach. And let me just say that finally we are on the right way. And the work, maybe it's still long, but we are really on the right way. And for the first time, I think that we have a strong and useful tool to refer to. So thanks again, An-Sofie. I just would like now to open the answer and question and answer session. We have time enough, so I really would like to have an interactive session. So I would like to give you the floor. So just raising your hands. You can also text the question in the chat box, but just raising your hands and I will allow you to talk. So maybe we can really build an interactive session as well. So just let me check. So please feel free to raise your hand to ask some question to An-Sofie, that we have the opportunity to have a person with this strong experience and expertise too on the CRPD. We have a question from Thomas. Thomas, now I will allow you to talk. Sorry, I lost you. Okay, Thomas, you can talk now.
Yeah, my name is Thomas. I'm calling from Uganda. Thanks, Sophie, for the presentation. Are you getting me?
Yeah, yes, of course.
Yeah, I have two questions.
So please let's talk because we can hear you.
Okay, the first question, I don't know how the CRPD gives an option of increasing the definition of disability. For instance, in Uganda and generally in Africa, we have two other categories of disabilities that we are working with, and these are the albinos and the little persons. Then the second question is, I'm only curious to find out how and the genesis of the Washington group of questions in assessing disability. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. I don't know if An-Sofie you want to answer directly now or we want to collect some. Okay. Just give the floor to Sylvester Roberts. Now you can talk. Hello?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Are you getting me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm Sylvester from Liberia. I work for ADFO in Liberia. Thank you for your presentation. You know, you did a very splendid presentation. I want to applaud you for that. But my question is, am I clear?
I'm sorry, but we can
Hello?
hear you. We can hear you. The sound is really bad. Can I ask you to text the question in the chat box and we will answer you directly, reading your question. Sorry, in the chat box. So I will try now to give the floor to Sunday. And please, sorry, Sylvester Roberts, you can text your question in the chat box. Now, Sandy, I give you the floor, allowed you to talk.
Okay, thank you, Alicia. My question is, first, you mentioned about 176 countries that have ratified the UNRCPD. Is there any mechanism for you to be able to determine how many countries have actually met the minimum standard or minimum requirements to say, yes, there is implementation? And I'm asking this question because looking at all that needs to be done in developing countries, say take Nigeria for instance, where I'm calling from, some of these even basic services cannot be even provided to abled persons. And people look at the huge cost of infrastructure in terms of ensuring that the UNRCPD is implemented the way it should be. So any ideas, any suggestions as what you think can be done? Because I see Europe and Africa, we are generational, I mean, thousands of years apart. I wonder when we would ever reach where we can provide buses where disabled people can get onto buses without any problem, where we can provide schools where children with disability can have good education. While this is all good, I'm all for it. I'm really struggling to understand in where I live how this can be ever practicable.
Thanks a lot. I don't know if you want to start answering, An-Sofie, or we continue with the questions. Maybe one more. So I give you the floor to Andrea Fichtmüller. I'm sorry for the pronunciation. So now you can talk, Andrea. Okay,
hello?
Now you can talk. Hello.
Okay, thank you. Yes, calling you from Abilis Foundation, Finland. We are supporting DPOs in the Global South, and we have a case in Tanzania where we are not quite sure how to advise them. DPOs have grouped together to form a consortium, and they have written the shadow report, so the alternative report. But now no one is going to treat that report because Tanzania has not, so the state of Tanzania has not fulfilled their reporting duties, and we are a bit in trouble how to advise now the DPOs how to go on with their shadow report. Are there any experiences among the listeners or from your side how to go about this case? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Now we stop just a little bit with the questions, and I give the floor to An-Sofie so she can answer, and then we restart again with a second round of questions. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much for these questions. They're all very interesting, and maybe the first one on people with albinism, I think it's very important to, include this group within the group of people with disabilities, as we've heard through several messages in the last years that people with albinism really face different human rights violations and really are excluded from society. So I think in all the work you undertake on people with disabilities, I would really encourage you to also involve people with albinism. And then on the question on the Washington group of questions, I think it's already a very good step forward in having CRPD compliant collection of data, because there has been several international instruments and international systems that actually had been looking at collecting data, but that was more based on looking at the medical model of people with disabilities, so really only collecting medical information. And I think that the Washington group set of questions is really a step forward in the good direction. So also here within the European Disability Forum, within my organization, we really promote this set of questions. So I would encourage you to continue working with them. Then the question regarding the fact that what would be the minimum standards and which countries actually have already implemented at a minimum level the UN Convention. I think it's a very good question. And I think, as you said, the situation differs very much from country to country and from continent to continent. And a good way of finding some inspiration and maybe finding some good practices also, or finding some minimum standards that can be applied everywhere, is to look at the concluding observations that the UN committee is making to all the different state parties. And there you will see that actually many state parties still face the same difficulties, still face the same issues, that people with disabilities in many countries are not able to vote, that many children with disabilities in many countries are not able to go to mainstream education. In Europe, it might be because we have such developed and well-resourced special education that it's very hard to make the shift to mainstream education. And in countries, maybe in Africa, it might be that there's no schooling at all. But so I think that even if the context is very different, the recommendations that we should take and that we should take forward are kind of the same. And then the question on the alternative report in Tanzania, I think it's really to applaud that the DPOs have come together and already have drafted an alternative report. It really shows that they're very proactively monitoring what the state is doing. Now, if the state, if I understand it well, if the state has not submitted its report to the UN committee itself, that indeed is problematic, and I would really encourage you maybe to contact the UN committee and its secretariat in Geneva itself, to maybe ask them how they have faced this problem and how they have encouraged other states to actually submit. But I think the fact that there is this alternative report from the DPOs itself is already a very good instrument at the national level to encourage and to really urge your government itself to submit its national report. And I think you should not wait for the review process to start in Geneva to actually already use your alternative report, all the data that you've collected, all the recommendations that you have put in this alternative report to also already change policy already from tomorrow on. So.
Thanks a lot, An-Sofie. Now we have some written questions that I'm going to read. The first one is from Julieta Seven. I'm sorry again for the pronunciation of your names, but I will try to do my best. So Julieta is, she asked, I understood that there are specific mechanisms to monitor the implementation of the convention, but what mechanisms are there to enforce and ensure that states fulfill their responsibility commitments? And then we have also another question from Parthipan, and he said, I observed the persons with mild physical disability, like polio and visual disability, receive maximum participation in DPOs and advocacy. Several disabilities like spinal cord injury or stroke really struggle to access to basic government scheme and benefits. The CRPD have any special provision to include people with severe disability? Then I suggest you to just give the answer to this question, and then I will give the floor again to the audience. Thanks a lot.
Yes, thank you very much for these questions. So the mechanism to monitor indeed and to really ensure that the state is actually implementing correctly the convention, as you already said, is at the national level the monitoring mechanism that really should have the competence and the mandate to issue recommendations on how the state should implement the convention and to really follow closely what the state is exactly doing and to go have meetings with the government, of course, in cooperation with the different organizations of people with disabilities, to follow up very closely and to really enforce the government that they're moving forward with this. If this would not be sufficient, obviously individuals can take a certain case also to court at the national level. We have had in Europe several cases where people with disabilities themselves or their family members have taken cases to court and where they were actually successful. In some countries, the ombudsman or the National Human Rights Institution might actually be able to support you in going to court, because we know it's a very costly and time costly also process. So this could be another way of really enforcing the government to implement the convention. And then if this also does not work, you can always go to the international level, and then I would go to the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities, both through the process that they do with every country to go through their state reports and to see how the government is doing and to making recommendations on how it can be approved. This is also a way of enforcing the implementation of the convention. And if it has not worked for you at the national level to bring your case to court, then you could also submit an individual complaint to the UN committee itself. This will not be a legally binding decision, but it might also, of course, help your government to, or push you to help your government implement the convention to make sure that they respect your rights. Then if the convention really specifically looks at people who have multiple disabilities and people with high support needs, the convention talks about this group of people in its preamble. It doesn't have a specific article on this, but I can tell you that obviously as we've gone through, the different approaches, and also if you would read the convention very carefully, you can see that really attention needs to be paid and support needs to be given to people who need more support than other people do. So this is also a very important group that also within the work of the European Disability Forum, we also try to include in all the proposals we make for new legislation and for new policy.
Thanks, An-Sofie. Now I'll give you the floor to Shurderson Subedi. Now you are allowed to talk. Sorry. I'm really sorry, Shurderson, but we have some technical problems to allow you to talk. So could you please write the question in the chat box? In the meantime, I will read the answer of the question of Theodore Mauro. And he asks, could you describe how the CRPD works with the UN partner organization like UNICEF, UNESCO, etc.? Do this organization have a CRPD officer, etc.? And also we have another question by Murali. He asks, I'm sorry, no, it's not a question. So I will try to give the floor to Shurderson again. I don't know why it's not allowing me to give you the floor. Okay, I will try to give the floor to Murali. Just try, because you are also an organizer. I'm really sorry for that. Oh, yes, now Shurderson, you are allowed to talk. Hello, finally. Thanks.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, thank you, An-Sofie. I feel great presentations, and it is more learning for me. Next week, I'm going to organize one training, especially CRPD TOT, and it is more helpful for me. Very quickly, my questions, because we just submitted, participated the 19th sessions, and CRPD committee sent the concluding recommendation to the Nepal government. In this situation, how did we can work to implement and to push the government to implement RPD recommendation? My first questions. And still Nepal government is not making the like a CRPD monitoring mechanism from the government. They just make a focal point. So we want to push that also, and can you advise me? And then third one is in 2021 Nepal government is going to do the census, so we want to include a broader definition in the census questionnaire in line with Washington group questions and others. And if you have any examples and if you have any advice, I think it is a very limited time in the webinar, but in later you can send email and information for me. It will be so helpful for us to do here. Thank you.
Thanks. Now I will give the floor. I will try to give the floor again to Murali. Murali, you are allowed to talk now. Hola. Hi.
Okay, thank you very much. I have been associated with this forum since 2012. I am one of the first participants in the Total program. I really want to know whether we will have some follow-up, because we are trying to get updated. Yeah. So your views on that.
Thanks a lot. I will read two more questions. I will read two more questions. One from Sylvester Roberts, and he asks, how do the DPOs or persons with disability how do the DPOs and persons with disability address their issues to the UN if their countries are not signed the optional protocol? Then I have another question from Alzuma, and say, my name is Salah Mountain and I'm a program manager at CBM's country office in Niger. as a part of the sensibilization of persons with disability in the public, we are recording audio interpretation of some articles of the CRPD. Could you give me some advice, for example, the most important articles, the key words related to these articles? Thank you. And just the last question from Silvia Lamy. Does the convention have a section of migrants who returns back to their home country who might suffer psychological distress after their return? Thanks a lot for this question. Now I will give the floor to An-Sofie again, and then we start with a third session of questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Many interesting questions I will try to answer. So the first question on how the UN system itself works and how the different UN agencies work together with, I guess, the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities. I have to say I don't work for the UN, so I am not so familiar. I work for a DPO here in Europe. But I know that, of course, all the different agencies such as UNICEF and UNESCO obviously also have to look at the UN Convention, and they have to implement the Convention also within their work. So I would imagine that within the different agencies, for example, in UNICEF, I know that there's people working specifically on the UN CRPD. I would imagine that also in the other UN agencies, it's the same, but I can maybe forward your question to our colleagues of the International Disability Alliance, to which EDF is actually a member, which is an organization of people with disabilities working more at the UN level, at the international level. So I'm sure they'll be able to answer that question in detail. Then from the gentleman from Nepal on the concluding observations that your country has just received from the CRPD committee. First of all, I think you have a very good tool in your hands to actually reinforce the implementation of your convention, and I would advise you to start drafting an action plan on how these concluding observations can be implemented. And so this action plan can really look at each recommendation that the government, that the CRPD committee has made to your government, and it can very detailed say which is actually the responsible ministry and what does this ministry have to do to make sure that this recommendation becomes a reality. So you basically detail the recommendations, and then you really address it. You go talk to the ministry to make sure that it happens. And I would say the same for establishing the independent framework. I don't know if you knew about the possibility or if it has been included within the recommendations that the CRPD committee made to your government, which we call urgent follow-up recommendations. These are recommendations to which the government has to reply within 1 year after the concluding observations were published. I think asking for the establishment of an independent framework is really some kind of recommendation that should be in this urgent follow-up recommendation. So this might be something for the future to think about, to also push your government to really move forward quickly. As you said rightly, this is a very important thing to have in your country, which is this independent framework that will monitor what your government is doing. Then on the Washington Group set of questions and the census, I'm happy to send you a document. It's true that unfortunately we don't have the time in this webinar to go into much detail. Also, the question that was on the Total program, I think it's the program that you referred to of the International Disability Alliance. So again, I was not directly involved. I know it exists and I know it's a great program, but I wasn't directly involved. So I can put you in contact with my colleagues at IDA to make sure that they can answer you on what is the follow-up on this. Then there was a question to whether, if your country has not ratified the optional protocol, what are the different mechanisms you have to write to or to actually be in contact with the UN mechanism. Well, there's several ones. I mean, the first one, as we already mentioned, is the fact that obviously your state will have to report to the CRPD committee on the actions it has taken to implement the convention, so which we call the review process. So obviously, as DPOs, you have the opportunity to be really involved in this review process, to draft your own alternative reports, saying what is the situation in your country on the rights of people with disabilities, and then to actively participate also to meet the CRPD committee if you have the chance, and to have really strong concluding observations with recommendations that can take the implementation of the convention forward in your country. However, the UN also has different other kind of human rights mechanisms. There's the Human Rights Council, which is a body also of the United Nations, which more looks at different states that have to report on what's the human rights situation overall of their country. They have to report this to other state parties of the UN. But I also know that their DPOs can provide input. So it's also another important UN mechanism. Of course, there's also the Special Rapporteur on the rights of people with disabilities, Ms. Catalina de Vandas, which can also receive any concerns you have, any questions you have. She's, for example, currently drafting a report on access to health and the right to health for people with disabilities. She has put out a questionnaire online where you can answer how is the situation with regards to health for people with disabilities. So this is also an important venue or an important mechanism to contribute to. Then there was a question on audio description of the CRPD and audio interpretation. I would really, maybe we can continue this conversation over email, but I would really encourage you to look at the first article of the convention up until Article 5, and then maybe Article 1, 2, 3, 4 are very important. And maybe Article 33 also, but there's so many different articles, so maybe we can have a further conversation over email. And then there was a question, if I understood correctly, on refugees with disabilities and the mental health situation. Obviously, the situation of refugees with disabilities is, I mean, all the rights of the convention apply to refugees with disabilities, and of course also to the mental health situation of refugees with disabilities. So here we have to ensure that refugees that return to their country, that they're able to access all public services, for example, mental health public services, that they are able to access them, that these mental health services are also inclusive of the support needs that they need, that they are also not discriminated when they have to find a job again or have to send their children to school. It's very important to interpret all the different rights of the convention also for this group of people. I don't know if there's any other questions.
So thanks a lot for your answers, An-Sofie. Now we have just time for a couple of questions more, and then also I ask you, to An-Sofie, to try to sum up your answers, because we have a quarter more. So I'm just reading two questions in the chat box. The first one is from Ruth. She said, I'm concerned about the registration of persons with disability. I'm in Uganda and I'm working with children with spina bifida and hydrocephalus, but each forum, especially government-aligned ministries, they question about the national statistics, but it's not documented. Could it be a problem with the categorization of disability or a gap in the system to capture the national statistics of persons with disability? Then I have another question from Rehab. Do you think that the local organization for persons with disability can play a great role with the UN in monitoring the state and in for the change of laws and policies? I think, I don't know if I will be able, I just would like to give the floor to Raya for the last question. Please, Raya, now you can talk. Hello? Okay, no, I can hear you, Raya, but I see that you written your answer, your question, so I'm not sorry, you have some just problem with the connection, and so no question. And if you have any other question for An-Sofie, just please raise your hands or try to text it on the chat box or raising your hand. If not, I give you the floor to An-Sofie for the last answer.
Thank you so much. So indeed, the first question on children with spina bifida, it's very problematic if these children are not captured in a data collection, because as you say, if they're not captured in a data collection, they will not be able, I mean, they will probably not be recognized as people with disabilities in your country, and so they will not be able to claim the necessary support services that they need to live. And so I would really recommend you to go to your government and to talk about the situation of this group of people with disabilities, and to make sure that in the next census, in the next data collection efforts, that this group of people with disabilities can be included. So I would really encourage you to do that. And then the question on local DPOs, there's very valuable information, expertise, of course, that local DPOs have, as they're really close to people with disabilities and to the difficulties if they live every day. So I would encourage you to get in contact with other DPOs in your country. Maybe there is a national DPO, an organization that brings together different local DPOs, different groups of people with disabilities. I think it's always important to join forces, to work together, preferably at the national level, because then it would also be easier for you to speak with one voice towards your government, to make your claims stronger towards your government. And it might also be easier to actually interact with the international level, as for example, the UN Committee on the Rights of People with Disabilities. If you can all come together and you can call on the same issues, you might also have very strong recommendations coming out of the review process when your country is being reviewed, for example. So that would be my answers.
So thank you very much, An-Sofie. Unfortunately, if we have still 10 minutes, so if you have any other question, you can do that now. I'm sorry for some attendees that raised their hand, like Babaya and Kanagas Bapati, but it seems that you don't have the microphone. So I can't allow you to talk. So please just text your question in the chat box. Yes, now I can see the Babaya microphone. So I give you the floor for the really last question. Thank you, Baba. Please, now you're allowed to talk.
Yes, I can't get the audio very well. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes, can hear you.
Yes, I've just managed to see you. I've had problems getting on. So has the webinar started?
Sorry?
Have you started the webinar already?
Yes, unfortunately, we are going to finish the webinar in 10 minutes. I don't know, maybe you have you had some problems, but don't worry, because tomorrow you will receive the follow-up email with the recording. Okay. So I'm really sorry for that. And if there is someone else that want to just make the last question to An-Sofie. If not, we are going to close the webinar. Okay. I'm sorry, I can see that you have a lot of hands raised. We'll try to give the floor now to Sylvia. Sylvia, you are allowed to talk.
Yes, good afternoon. I would like to share with the African colleagues one tools that could be very interesting because during you know, the question, the problem of IDP person with disability, this tool is the draft protocol to the African chapter on humans and people's rights on the rights of persons with disability in Africa. That, for example, in his Article 6 is talking about practice like the one addressed to people with albinism, and in its Article 7 talk openly about persons with disability that are affected by war or emergency situation. So in my opinion, for the organizations that are working in an African context, also the protocol could be a very interesting tool. Still is a draft, but it seems that in few weeks will become official. Just to share this important tool.
Thanks a lot, Sylvia. I don't know if An-Sofie, do you want to comment on that? If not, I'm going really now to read the last question, and is what could be your perspective as it's related to having many countries having to sign the convention, but less countries signing the optional protocol. What do you think could be a state fair? That's it. So now, An-Sofie, I give you the floor to answer to the last question.
Yes, that's a very good question. And I actually have the same question here in Europe because all of the European member states and the European Union itself have ratified the UN Convention, but many of them still have not ratified the optional protocol, and also the European Union has not ratified it. So I'm not necessarily sure about what would be the fear of the state, maybe rather than fearing the fact that another international body might actually condemn them or say, okay, you have done something wrong, you violated the rights of this and this individual, which is actually what the optional protocol allows individuals to bring individual complaints to the CRPD committee and for the CRPD committee to take this decision. So I know that, for example, at the European Union level, it's also a matter of legal uncertainty because for the European Union level, obviously, they're not sure about all the different remedies at the national level, but also at the European Union level that have to be exhausted before an individual within the European Union could go to the CRPD committee. So I think that's really a complex mix of reasons why different countries might not feel so eager actually to ratify the optional protocol. But I think it's something very important to do, as in some countries and also at the European Union level, individuals might actually really, I mean, their human rights might be violated, they might not have any recourse, they might not have any remedy that they can run to. So then it's important, obviously, to have this option at the international level with the CRPD committee. Thank you.
So, well, thanks a lot, An-Sofie, for this really, really interesting session. And I really would like to, we are at the end of our session. I invite you because I saw that there are a lot of raised hands and other questions in the chat box. I'm just asking you because unfortunately we finished our time. So please text your questions to me or An-Sofie, and we are going to answer with pleasure to all your questions. And you can find the email address of An-Sofie now on the screen, and mine in the reminder and also in the follow-up email. So thanks a lot to everyone to join this session. And I really, really hope that you enjoyed the webinar and it was useful to understand really the basic principle of the convention. I would like to remind you that tomorrow you will receive an email, a follow-up email with the webinar recording and all the related documents presented today. And you will receive a survey with the follow-up email. So I kindly ask you to just answer to this survey to help us to improve the quality of this webinar. As I said at the beginning of the session, this is just the first webinar of a training cycle of 12 webinars. The second one will be about the SDGs and their explicit reference to disability, and it will be foreseen the last week of April, the week of the 23rd, but we will come back to you with a definite date as soon as possible, and also with the registration link. For any other question, as I said, or for if you have doubts, etc. Please don't hesitate to contact me. And in that case, for the specific question on this session, send an email to An-Sofie. And well, thank you to everybody. I hope to see you also during the next session. Thanks again to An-Sofie. Bye. Enjoy the rest of the day.